Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The kingdom of Arleth had always been a land of storms. From the moment one crossed its borders, the sky seemed to darken, the wind whipped into a frenzy, and the rain fell in relentless sheets. It was as if the heavens themselves were angry with this place, determined to drown it in an endless deluge. The people of Arleth had grown used to it, though. They built their homes with strong roofs, carved deep channels for the water to drain away, and learned to live with the constant roar of thunder and the flash of lightning that split the skies. But there was one thing that kept the people of Arleth from despair, one thing that gave them hope and reminded them of beauty even in the midst of the unending storm. That was the song of the nightingale. The nightingale's song was unlike any other sound in the kingdom. It was pure, clear, and melodic, a beacon of peace in a world of chaos. When the bird sang, the storms seemed to lessen, the winds calmed, and for a brief moment, the kingdom knew tranquility. The nightingale was kept in the king's palace, a closely guarded treasure that was never seen by the people. It sang only at specific times, on the king's command, and each time it did, the entire kingdom paused to listen, savoring those precious moments of calm. John had heard the nightingale's song many times in his life. Growing up in a small village on the outskirts of Arleth, he had always been fascinated by it. Even as a child, he would sit by the window during the fiercest storms, listening for the nightingale's song to cut through the noise, offering a moment of peace. It was this fascination that had driven him to become a musician. He had always had a gift for music, a natural talent that he honed with years of practice. His dream was to one day play in the king's court, to be close to the nightingale and understand the magic of its song. When John arrived in the capital, he was full of hope and ambition. The city was unlike anything he had ever seen. The buildings were tall and grand, the streets were busy with people from all walks of life, and everywhere he went, he could hear the sounds of music, conversation, and life. But there was also the storm, ever present and unyielding. The rain never ceased, and the wind howled through the streets, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and earth. Yet, despite the weather, the city thrived, and John was determined to make his mark here. He quickly found work as an apprentice to the court's chief musician, a stern but talented man named Master Alaric. Under Alaric's tutelage, John's skills improved rapidly. He learned to play the lute, the harp, and the flute, mastering each instrument with ease. He also learned to compose music, crafting melodies that were both beautiful and haunting, inspired by the stormy world around him. But it was the nightingale's song that continued to haunt him. Every time the bird sang, John would stop whatever he was doing and listen, captivated by the purity of the sound. He began to spend more and more time studying the nightingale's song, trying to understand its structure, its rhythm, its melody. He would sit for hours with his instruments, trying to replicate the sound, but no matter how close he came, there was always something missing. Then, one evening, as the storm raged outside and the nightingale's song filled the palace, John found himself alone in the music chamber. He picked up his flute and began to play, mimicking the nightingale's song as he had done countless times before. But this time, something was different. The notes flowed from his instrument with a clarity and purity that he had never achieved before. The sound was so close to the nightingale's that, for a moment, John himself was surprised. He continued to play, and as he did, the storm outside began to calm, the wind lessened, and the rain slowed to a gentle patter. When he finished, there was silence. John stood there, his heart pounding, the flute still in his hands. Had he really done it? Had he really managed to replicate the nightingale's song? It was then that he heard a slow clap from the doorway. He turned to see Master Alaric standing there, a look of amazement on his face. "That was extraordinary," Alaric said, stepping into the room. "I've never heard anything like it." It was almost as if the nightingale itself was playing. John felt a surge of pride. "I've been working on it for a long time," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I didn't think I would ever get it right." Alaric nodded, still looking at him with something akin to awe. "The king will want to hear this," he said finally. "He's always looking for ways to control the storms better. If you can replicate the nightingale's song, well, who knows what that could mean." The next day, John was summoned to the king's chamber. The king, a stern and imposing figure, listened as John played the nightingale's song. When he finished, the king was silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowed as he studied John. "You have a rare talent, young man," the king said finally. "Tell me, how did you come to learn the nightingale's song so perfectly?" John hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain it. It wasn't something he had learned, exactly. It was more like something he had felt, something that had come to him naturally after years of listening and practicing. "I've always been drawn to the nightingale's song," he said carefully. "I've spent years studying it, trying to understand it. I suppose I've just been able to mimic it." The king nodded slowly, considering this. "You will continue to play for me," he said. "Whenever the nightingale is not singing, you will take its place. But be warned, this is not something to be taken lightly. The nightingale's song is what keeps the storms at bay. If you fail, well, the consequences could be dire." John agreed, though a part of him was uneasy. He wasn't sure what the king meant by consequences, but he pushed the thought aside. This was his chance to prove himself, to show that he was more than just an apprentice. He couldn't let doubt stop him. For the next few weeks, John played for the king regularly. Each time, the storms would calm, just as they did when the nightingale sang. The king was pleased, and John quickly became a favorite at court. He was given new clothes, a room in the palace, and a place of honor at the king's table. His life had changed in ways he had never imagined, but as time went on, John began to notice something strange. The storms, while still calming when he played, seemed to be growing more intense at other times. The winds were fiercer, the rain heavier, and the lightning more frequent. It was as if the storms were responding to something, growing angrier and more violent. John also noticed that the nightingale seemed to be weakening. Its song, once so pure and strong, was becoming softer, more strained. The bird, which had always been vibrant and full of life, now seemed tired, its feathers dull and its movements slow. One evening, after the nightingale had finished singing, John approached its cage. The bird looked up at him with weary eyes, and for a moment, John felt a pang of guilt. Was his mimicry somehow harming the nightingale? Was he taking something from it each time he played? He began to spend more time in the palace library, searching through ancient texts and manuscripts, looking for answers. He read about the history of the kingdom, about the storms that had plagued it for centuries, and about the nightingale, which had been brought to the palace long ago to keep the storms at bay. It was in an old, dusty book that John found what he was looking for. The text spoke of an ancient spirit, a force of nature that had once ruled the skies over Arleth. This spirit, known as the Tempest, was said to be the source of the kingdom's storms. It was a powerful and dangerous force, and it had only been contained by the song of the nightingale, a magical creature that had the power to calm the tempest's fury. John's heart raced as he read. The nightingale wasn't just a bird with a beautiful song, it was the kingdom's only defense against a force that could destroy everything. And now, with the nightingale weakening, the tempest was beginning to stir once more. He realized with a sinking feeling that his mimicry, while effective in calming the storms temporarily, was not enough to keep the tempest at bay. Worse, it might even be contributing to the nightingale's decline, weakening the very creature that was holding the tempest in check. John knew he had to do something. He couldn't continue to deceive the king, not when the fate of the entire kingdom was at stake. But what could he do? If he stopped playing, the king would surely have him punished, and the storms would grow even worse. But if he continued, the nightingale might die, and the tempest would be unleashed. That night, as he lay in his bed, John couldn't sleep. The storm outside was fiercer than ever, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows. He could feel the tempest's anger, could sense its power growing. He had to make a choice. The next day, John made his decision. He would release the nightingale. It was the only way to save the kingdom, even if it meant his own life. He waited until nightfall, when the palace was quiet, and the storm was at its peak. Then, he made his way to the king's chamber, where the nightingale was kept. The bird was resting, its eyes closed, its breathing slow and labored. John hesitated for a moment, his hand on the latch of the cage. Was he doing the right thing? Would releasing the nightingale really save the kingdom, or was he dooming them all? But then he thought of the tempest, of the destruction it could bring, and his resolve hardened. He opened the cage. The nightingale opened its eyes and looked at him. For a moment, they stared at each other, and John could have sworn he saw understanding in the bird's gaze. Then, the nightingale spread its wings and flew out of the cage, through the open window, and into the storm. For a moment, nothing happened. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling and the rain pouring down. But then, the nightingale's song began to rise above the noise, clear and pure as ever. The storm seemed to pause, the winds dying down, the rain slowing to a drizzle. The nightingale's song grew louder, filling the air, and for a moment, there was peace, but it was short-lived. The tempest, sensing the nightingale's departure, roared to life with a fury that shook the palace. The wind screamed, tearing through the city, and the rain fell in torrents, flooding the streets. Lightning flashed, striking the palace towers, and thunder rumbled so loudly it felt like the earth itself was shaking. John ran through the palace, trying to escape the destruction. He could hear the king's guards shouting, could see the terrified faces of the courtiers as they fled. But there was no escape from the tempest's wrath. He made it to the palace gates, but before he could get outside, a bolt of lightning struck the ground in front of him, throwing him off his feet. He lay there, dazed, the storm raging around him, and for a moment, he thought he was going to die. But then, through the chaos, he heard the nightingale's song once more. It was faint, barely audible over the roar of the storm, but it was there, and it was growing stronger. The tempest hesitated, its fury lessening as the nightingale's song filled the air. Slowly, the wind began to die down, the rain stopped, and the lightning ceased. The nightingale's song rose above it all, clear and pure, and the tempest retreated, defeated. John lay there, soaked and exhausted, as the nightingale's song brought calm to the kingdom once more. The storm was over. When he finally stood up, the city was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, the sky was clear. The stars shone brightly overhead, and the moon cast a soft light over the kingdom. John knew that the nightingale had saved them. It had tamed the tempest, at least for now. But he also knew that things would never be the same. The nightingale was free, and without it, the kingdom would be vulnerable to the tempest's wrath once more. He returned to the palace, where the king was waiting for him. The king's face was pale, and his hands trembled as he spoke. "You have done a great service to this kingdom, John," the king said. "But you have also unleashed a great danger. The nightingale is gone, and with it, our protection against the tempest." John nodded, his heart heavy. "I know, your majesty. But the nightingale's song still holds power. As long as it remains in the land, the tempest will not be able to fully awaken." The king sighed, looking out at the calm sky. "I hope you are right, John. For all our sakes." In the days that followed, the kingdom began to rebuild. The people were in awe of the clear skies and the absence of storms, but there was also a sense of unease. They knew that the nightingale's departure had left them vulnerable, and they looked to the future with a mixture of hope and fear. John continued to live in the palace, though he no longer played for the king. Instead, he spent his days composing music, crafting melodies that echoed the nightingale's song, hoping to keep its memory alive. But he knew that the nightingale's song was more than just a melody. It was a force of nature, a power that could not be replicated by human hands. And as the days passed and the skies remained clear, he knew that the nightingale's work was not done. One evening, as he sat by the window, watching the sunset, he heard a familiar sound. The nightingale's song, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. He smiled, knowing that the bird was still out there, watching over the kingdom. The storm might return one day, but for now, there was peace, and as long as the nightingale sang, there was hope.